One night, one hit, 185,000 soldiers fell without a single arrow being fired. What happened in the outskirts of Jerusalem go on being one of the most amazing mysteries of the sacred history. Was it a divine act or a natural disaster? To understand the impact of this event, we must travel in time to an era of brutal conquests, of empires that were imposed by the strength and kings who believed themselves to be gods in the earth. In the 8th century BC, the Empire Assyrian was the most feared war machine in the world. His armies were invincible, and their campaigns of terror left a trail of cities in ruins and subjugated villages. Jerusalem was on the verge of the destruction. Its king Hezekiah faced an impossible dilemma: surrender to the Assyrians or trust in a miracle. His enemy, the king Sennacherib, had conquered dozens of cities and now had Jerusalem surrounded. The victory, it seemed inevitable. The Assyrians were not only known for their military power, but also by its cruelty. The kings who dared resist, they were tortured and exposed as an example for others. Villages, their strategy was clear: crush the morale of his enemies before even raising his sword. The walls of Jerusalem were strong, but could they resist the most advanced war machinery of the time? In the interior of the city, the town, I was terrified. The provisions were scarce, the water began to be missing, and the echo of the Assyrian drums announced the imminent assault. In that moment of despair, Hezekiah made a decision that would change the history. Instead of seeking military alliances or surrendering, he went to God's temple and prayed. His plea was clear: Lord, save us, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God. That night, while the Assyrians, they slept confidently in his victory, something inexplicable happened. When the sun rose, 185,000 soldiers were dead. Did it really happen? Was it a miracle, or is there a scientific explanation? Today we will explore every detail of this event, analyzing the biblical perspective and the historical theories that have attempted to decipher this enigma. Get ready to discover a tale of faith, power, and divine justice that continues to baffle the world to this day. Today, in the 8th century BC, the Empire Assyrian was the elderly superpower of the ancient world. Its army was composed of tens of thousands of disciplined and brutal soldiers, trained to raise cities and subdue entire kingdoms. They were not simple warriors, but an unstoppable war machine with advanced weaponry, strategies innovative, and an absolute mastery of the art of siege. The Assyrians not only conquered, but they sowed terror. They were famous for their cruelty with the defeated. Chronicles of the time describe as they impaled their enemies on stakes. They skinned the animals alive prisoners and completely destroyed the rebellious cities. They left no traces of resistance. The kings who opposed were executed and their people deported to prevent future rebellions. The king Sennacherib, one of the most powerful Assyrian monarchs, had carried out a devastating campaign in the region of Judah. During his journey, he conquered 46 fortified cities and reduced countless to rubble. Villages. Jerusalem was the last piece of the board. When the army Assyrian arrived at gates of Jerusalem, the city was under siege. Inside, the king Hezekiah and his town. They knew that the situation was desperate. Jerusalem had no the resources nor military power to confront the Assyrians. Defeat seemed inevitable. The Assyrian commander Rabshakeh, sent by Sennacherib, approached the walls and proclaimed out loud a message intended to sow fear among the inhabitants of the city. "Do not trust in your God," he cried. "The nations that we have destroyed also, they had gods, and none of them could save them. Surrender now and they will live." These words were not just threats, but part of a psychological strategy. Rabshakeh, I knew that if I managed to break the morale of the people, Jerusalem would fall without the Assyrians had to fight. But the king Hezekiah was not intimidated. Instead of responding with violence or seek help in other kingdoms, did something unexpected. He searched the guide of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah considered the voice of God in Judah, sent a strong message. Do not be afraid, because the mister says that the king of Assyria will not come into this city. He will not even shoot an arrow at it. For the Assyrians, this was ridiculous. None city had resisted his power. Jerusalem would not be the exception. The fate of the city, it seemed sealed. But that same night, everything would change forever. Hezekiah, it was not a king common. Unlike his predecessors, who had turned away from God and adopted pagan cults, he had promoted a radical reform in Judah. He destroyed idols, banned the worship of false gods, and restored the Temple of Jerusalem as the only legitimate center of worship. Its government was based in the conviction that only Yahweh could protect his town. However, the arrival of the army Assyrian put to the test his faith like never before. Jerusalem was surrounded by the most feared military force of its time, and the threats of Rabshakeh resonated within the walls of the city. The town began to doubt, would God really intervene to save them? Hezekiah I had two options. The first was to give up, accept Sennacherib's dominion, and avoid the total destruction of Jerusalem. This was the logical option, the one that any strategist would recommend. The second option was to resist, relying solely on Isaiah's promise, although everything indicated that it would be a suicide, but that the king did not hesitate. Instead of trying to negotiate with the Assyrians or seek help in Egypt, he went straight to the temple and prostrated himself before God. He opened a letter sent by Sennacherib, where the Assyrian monarch mocked the faith of Hezekiah and him. He warned that his God could not save him. Then he sent up a desperate prayer. Lord, God of Israel, who dwells among the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes and look. Look at the words of Sennacherib, who has sent insults against the living God. The silence filled the temple room. There was no allied armies marching in his help. There were no escape plans. There was only his faith. Shortly after noon, Isaiah arrived with an unexpected answer. With a certainty unbreakable, the prophet transmitted a message from God. Do not be afraid. They will not enter in this city. They will not shoot arrows at it. For the way they came, by that same they will return. For I will defend this city to save it. This message defied all logic. The Assyrians were in the door. How could be defeated without battle? Would God act directly? Hezekiah chose believe. He ordered his people who did not enter panicked and prepared for what was to come. That night, while the Assyrians, they slept confidently in his victory. A mysterious event would change the history forever. The moon illuminated the vast Assyrian camp. From the top of the walls of Jerusalem, the sentinels, they could see the countless shops, the shine of the armor, and the glow of the bonfires that burned in the darkness. The enemy, he slept confidently, sure that at dawn the city would fall under his domain. For the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the evening it was long. Fear weighed heavily in the air, and the echo of the Hezekiah's prayer still resonated in the hearts of the people. Would God respond? Could he, a miracle, save them from what inevitable? Meanwhile, in the Assyrian camp, everything seemed calm. The soldiers were resting after weeks of siege, sure of their imminent victory. But in some point in the night, something happened, something that no historian has been able to fully explain. When the sun began to rise in the horizon, the sentinels Assyrians who were on guard, they must have noticed something was wrong. There was a strange, unnatural silence. As the light of the tomorrow illuminated the camp, the reality hit with terrifying force. Tens of thousands of soldiers lay dead in the ground. Their bodies were intact, without signs of battle. There was no bloodshed. There was no fighting. There was no sound of the clash of swords, nor the cry of the dying. They were simply dead. 185,000 soldiers, the thick of the most feared army in the world, had perished in a single night. Panic took hold of the survivors. Nobody knew that had happened. Some they tried to wake their companions, only to discover that there was no life in their bodies. Fear paralyzed the officers, and in a matter of minutes, the entire camp was engulfed in chaos. The Bible states that it was he, angel of the mister, who descended and executed he divine judgment on the invaders. God's intervention was immediate, lethal and absolute. Not a single arrow was fired from the walls of Jerusalem. It was not necessary. But what? Did it really happen? Some historians have attempted to explain the death massive with scientific hypotheses. It has been suggested that it may have been a sudden epidemic, perhaps a fulminating plague that attacked the army. Assyrian. Other theory mentions the possibility of a toxic gas emanating from the ground, capable of suffocating soldiers in a matter of hours. However, none of these hypotheses can explain why it happened precisely in a single night and in a way so definitive. Since the walls of Jerusalem, the scene was hard to believe. The soldiers who hours before threatened with destroying the city were dead, and the huge army that was there, spread terror throughout the region, now lay in complete silence. The Assyrians who succeeded, it didn't take long for them to survive and flee, abandoning their weapons, provisions, and even their banners. For them, what had happened was a curse, a revenge from an unknown god whom they had defied. When the news came to Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, his reaction was immediate: ordered the retreat. The great conqueror, the monarch who had destroyed dozens of cities, now it was seen forced to return to Nineveh with empty hands and the shame of a defeat that no one could grasp. While Assyrian he fled, the people of Jerusalem gathered in the temple. Hezekiah there was believed in the promise of God, and Isaiah had prophesied the salvation of the city. Now the prophecy had been fulfilled in a manner spectacular. The most powerful empire on earth had been defeated without a single warrior Jew had to fight. But the history of Sennacherib, it wasn't over yet. The humiliation he suffered that evening, it was just the beginning of his fall. The great king of Assyria, the man who had sown the terror in countless nations, returned to his capital Nineveh with the shame of an inexplicable defeat. Its inscriptions and reliefs, they count with pride in their victories. But there are a revealing detail. They do not mention the conquest of Jerusalem. In his official records, Sennacherib describes as place the city and how he locked up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. However, the history stops there. There are no accounts of a victory. There are no mentions of the fall of Jerusalem. It is as if great conqueror would like to erase from the history the fact that for the first time its army had been defeated without even enter into combat. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the news of the Assyrian flight was received with joy. The people celebrated the salvation of his city as a miracle. Hezekiah had trusted in God, and Isaiah had spoken with truth. The Assyrians would not enter in the city, nor they would shoot a single arrow at her. But the Sennacherib's humiliation did not end there. Years after his return to Nineveh, his own destiny was sealed in a tragic way. While worshipped their gods in the temple of Nisroch, 2 of his sons they murdered in cold blood. The great conqueror, who had defeated kingdoms and crushed armies, found his end not in the battlefield, but in his own sanctuary, betrayed by his own blood. Isaiah's prophecy was fulfilled in every detail. Jerusalem was saved, the army Assyrian was annihilated, and the king who defied the God of Israel ended up his life in misfortune. The story of Sennacherib leaves us with a powerful lesson. No human power, however great, can challenge the divine will. The empires, they rise and fall, but there are forces that are beyond of the control of the kings and conquerors. For Judah, this event was a test irrefutable that his God was the only true one. For the world, he continues being one of the older mysteries of the history ancient. But one question still remains. How is the destruction of the army Assyrian? Dawn brought with it a scene that no inhabitant of Jerusalem would forget, never. Outside the walls, whether they were camping the night before, tens of thousands of Assyrian soldiers, only corpses and a deathly silence remained. The army that had entire kingdoms had been destroyed, and fortified cities had been reduced to ruins in a single night. Joy inside Jerusalem was indescribable. What seemed an inevitable fate had been reversed a moment. There was no need to wield swords or shoot arrows. God had fought for his people and had defeated the most feared enemy without a single soldier of Judah having to enter combat. The Isaiah's words had been complemented with precision. He will defend this city and will save it. For the inhabitants of Jerusalem, there was no doubt that they had witnessed a miracle. The temple was filled with songs of praise and sacrifices of gratitude. Hezekiah, the king who had trusted in God in the most critical moment, he was now seen as a leader blessed from above. Decision not to give up, not to seek alliances with Egypt nor other kingdoms, had been justified from the most spectacular way possible. This event marked a before and a after in the history of Judah. While many nations fell under the domain Assyrian, Jerusalem remained standing. The city, which was doomed to destruction, became a symbol of the divine protection. But the victory also left questions that resonate to this day. What really killed 185,000 soldiers in a single night? A supernatural event or a coincidental natural disaster? It is true that this event continues to baffle historians and scientists. What for the faith was an act of God, for the history go on being an enigma. Still so. One lesson is clear: human power may seem unstoppable, but even the strongest army is nothing against the willpower of the Most High. But what passed exactly that night? Let's examine the possible explanations behind this event. The mysterious destiny of the army Assyrian go on being an enigma until the today. For the believers, there are none doubt, was a divine act, a miracle that demonstrated the absolute power of God and his protection over Jerusalem. The biblical story has been passed down for centuries as a testimony of faith and justice. However, historians and scientists have attempted to find alternative explanations. Some suggest that a devastating plague could have finished with Assyrian soldiers during the night. Others point to the possibility of a natural disaster, such as a toxic gas emanating from the ground, which suffocated the army while was sleeping. But more fascinating is that whatever the cause, the result was the same. The most powerful empire of the time suffered a humiliating defeat without Jerusalem had to fight. The story of Sennacherib and Hezekiah leaves us with a great lesson. Human power is ephemeral, and no empire, however strong it may seem, is above the divine will. Now I ask you, do you think it was a miracle or is there a scientific explanation? Leave us your opinion in the comments and share this mystery with others.